The most dangerous mistake a person in power can make is deciding who deserves respect before learning who they really are. Imagine sitting in a quiet hometown diner just after sunrise, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air while bacon crackles on the grill and waitresses greet regulars by name. It looks like the kind of peaceful morning that never makes the evening news. But sometimes the smallest places become the stage for the biggest lessons. On that crisp fall morning in Ashford, Georgia, Main Street was slowly waking up beneath a pale golden sky. Pickup trucks rolled past storefronts that had stood for generations, church bells echoed faintly across town, and locals settled into familiar routines without realizing they were about to witness a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. Inside Maggie's country kitchen, conversations floated softly between booths as coffee mugs clinked against saucers. Farmers discussed the weather. Teachers prepared for another school day. Retired veterans exchanged stories they had told dozens of times before. Near the front window, a neatly dressed black man sat alone in a corner booth. He appeared to be in his early 50s, calm and unhurried, wearing a navy button-down shirt beneath a light gray jacket. A folded newspaper rested beside his plate while he quietly enjoyed scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee. There was nothing flashy about him. No expensive watch. No security detail. No official vehicle parked outside. If anyone glanced his way, they saw only another traveler passing through a small southern town. His name was Marcus Ellington, though nobody inside the diner recognized it. That was exactly how he preferred it. For nearly 3 decades, Marcus had learned that the clearest picture of a community often appeared when nobody knew who was watching. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed details other people overlooked. A waitress thanked him for holding the door earlier. He smiled warmly and wished her a good morning. An elderly customer accidentally dropped a napkin, and Marcus quietly picked it up before returning to his breakfast. His calm presence blended naturally into the rhythm of the diner, almost invisible to everyone around him. Then the front door swung open. Conversations softened almost instantly. Boots struck the wooden floor with slow, confident steps. Sheriff Bradley Hayes entered wearing a perfectly pressed tin uniform, polished badge gleaming beneath the overhead lights. He carried himself with the unmistakable confidence of someone who believed authority entered every room before he did. Several customers nodded respectfully. Others lowered their eyes. In Ashford, Sheriff Hayes wasn't simply a law enforcement officer. To many people, he was the law itself. His sharp eyes swept across the dining room with practiced certainty until they settled on Marcus. The sheriff stopped walking. For a brief second, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. Marcus calmly lifted his coffee cup, completely unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that breakfast was about to become something no one in that room would ever forget. Marcus Ellington buttered another piece of toast with the same steady hands that had signed some of the most important decisions in federal law enforcement. Yet there was nothing about his appearance that hinted at the weight of those responsibilities. That was intentional. He believed the strongest leaders did not need to announce themselves. They listened first. They observed quietly. They learned what people revealed when they believed no one important was watching. Ashford was only one stop on a week-long trip that had never appeared on any public schedule. Officially, there was no visit. No press conference had been announced. No courthouse meeting had been listed. Even the local field office knew only that a senior federal official might arrive sometime during the week. Only 3 people in Washington knew the complete itinerary, and Marcus intended to keep it that way until his work was finished. Across the diner, Maggie herself poured another cup of coffee into an elderly customer's mug before smiling toward Marcus. "Everything tasting all right, sweetheart?" she asked with the warm kindness that had made her restaurant the heart of the town for almost 40 years. Marcus looked up with an easy smile. "It is excellent. Thank you. I have not had homemade biscuits this good in a long time." She laughed proudly. "That recipe belonged to my grandmother. Folks say I have not ruined it yet." The light-hearted exchange drew quiet smiles from nearby customers, and for a moment the room felt exactly as it should. Comfortable, familiar, safe. Marcus appreciated places like this because they reminded him why public service mattered. Government was never just offices in Washington. It was ordinary people starting another workday, hoping to be treated fairly wherever they lived. He unfolded the local newspaper resting beside his plate. The front page featured the annual Harvest Festival, a high school football victory, and a photograph of Sheriff Bradley Hayes shaking hands during a community fundraiser. The headline praised the sheriff for maintaining order throughout the county. Marcus studied the article without changing his expression. Reputation often told only part of a story. Experience had taught him that respect earned through integrity looked very different from authority maintained through fear. At the opposite end of the diner, two deputies quietly entered to pick up breakfast orders for the courthouse. The moment they noticed Sheriff Hayes standing near the entrance, both straightened instinctively. One adjusted his uniform collar before speaking. "Morning, Sheriff." Bradley answered with only a brief nod, never taking his eyes off Marcus. Something about the stranger seemed to bother him, though even he could not have explained exactly why. Perhaps it was Marcus's quiet confidence. Perhaps it was simply the fact that he did not seem nervous under the sheriff's attention like so many visitors did. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Forks slowed. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips. Even the old jukebox humming softly in the corner suddenly seemed louder than the conversations that had filled the room only moments before. Marcus calmly folded his newspaper, placed it neatly beside his plate, and reached for his coffee once again. His expression remained relaxed, almost thoughtful, as though the growing tension belonged to someone else entirely. Outside the front window, a cool breeze carried yellow leaves across Main Street while the town continued its ordinary morning, completely unaware that within the next few minutes a single decision inside this little diner would begin changing far more than anyone could possibly imagine. Sheriff Bradley Hayes finally took another slow step forward, the polished leather of his boots echoing across the worn wooden floor with deliberate confidence. Every pair of eyes inside Maggie's country kitchen drifted between the sheriff and the quiet stranger sitting alone by the window. Marcus Ellington remained focused on his breakfast, cutting another bite of toast before calmly setting his fork down. His movements were unhurried, almost as though he had learned long ago that another person's impatience should never become his own. Bradley stopped beside the booth and looked down with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Morning," he said, though the word carried little warmth. Marcus looked up politely. "Good morning, Sheriff." The simple greeting caught Bradley slightly off guard. Most visitors only recognized him after reading the embroidered name above his badge. Marcus had noticed at the moment the sheriff entered, but offered nothing more than a respectful nod. Passing through, Bradley asked, "You could say that," Marcus replied with a calm smile. "I have a few meetings in the area. Business. Something like that." The answer seemed ordinary enough, yet it somehow irritated the sheriff. There was no nervousness, no unnecessary explanation, no attempt to impress him. Marcus answered every question directly without volunteering anything beyond what had been asked. Bradley folded his arms. "I do not believe I have seen you around Ashford before. That is because this is my first visit. Where are you staying? Just for today?" The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "That is not what I asked." Marcus met his gaze without raising his voice. A small hotel outside town. Around them, the diner had become remarkably quiet. Even those pretending not to listen found themselves following every word. Maggie stood behind the counter, drying the same coffee mug for nearly a full minute without realizing it. The two deputies waiting for their breakfast exchanged uncertain glances but remained silent. Bradley rested one hand on the edge of the booth. "Mind showing me some identification?" Marcus looked at him thoughtfully for a brief moment before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. Instead of rushing, he carefully removed a simple leather wallet and placed it on the table beside his coffee. He did not open it immediately. "May I ask if there is a particular reason?" he asked with genuine courtesy. Bradley answered without hesitation. "Routine questions." Marcus nodded once. "I appreciate officers doing their jobs." He opened the wallet just enough to retrieve a standard driver's license and placed it on the table. Bradley picked it up, studying it longer than seemed necessary. The address belonged to Virginia. The photograph matched perfectly. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Yet something about the stranger continued to challenge the sheriff's instincts. Marcus watched patiently while Bradley examined the card. There was no frustration in his expression, only quiet composure that somehow made the sheriff feel as though he were the one being observed. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the diner, its engine briefly filling the silence before disappearing down Main Street. Inside, nobody resumed eating. Nobody returned to their conversations. Every second stretched a little longer than the one before it. Bradley handed the license back, but did not step away. Instead, he glanced toward the empty booth across the aisle, then back to Marcus, as if searching for a reason that had not yet revealed itself. Marcus slipped the license back into his wallet and thanked him with the same calm courtesy he had shown from the beginning. That simple act should have ended the conversation. Instead, it marked the moment when ordinary curiosity quietly gave way to something far more troubling, and no one inside the diner realized they were only moments away from witnessing a decision that would echo far beyond the streets of Ashford. Bradley Hayes should have walked away. The identification matched. The conversation had remained respectful. There had been no raised voices, no disturbance, no complaint from anyone inside the diner. Yet something deep inside him refused to let the encounter end. He had spent years trusting his own instincts without questioning where those instincts came from, and this morning they whispered that the quiet stranger sitting before him did not belong. Marcus Ellington reached calmly for his coffee, taking another slow sip before placing the cup back onto its saucer with careful precision. "Is there anything else I can help you with, Sheriff?" he asked in the same courteous tone that had never changed since the conversation began. Bradley studied him for another long moment. "You said you have meetings." "Yes." "With who?" Marcus smiled politely. "I am afraid those meetings are private." The answer landed heavily in the silent room. Bradley's jaw tightened. "Private?" "Yes, sir. Everything is private with you." Marcus folded his hands together on the table. "Some work requires discretion. I am sure you understand that." The sentence was respectful, but Bradley heard it differently. To him, it sounded like someone refusing to answer questions from the highest authority in town. Behind the counter, Maggie shifted uneasily. She had known Bradley for nearly 20 years and recognized the expression forming on his face. It was the look he wore whenever he believed someone had challenged him, even quietly. One of the deputies leaned toward the other and whispered, "This should be over already." His partner nodded but kept his eyes fixed on the sheriff. Marcus noticed the growing discomfort around the room. He could almost feel people silently hoping the conversation would end before it became something larger. He understood that feeling. Throughout his career, he had visited communities across the country where ordinary citizens simply wanted peace. They wanted fairness. They wanted to believe that respect flowed both ways between those who served the public and those they were sworn to protect. Marcus gently reached for his breakfast again. "If there is nothing further, Sheriff, I would like to finish my meal before it gets cold." Bradley did not move. Instead, he glanced toward the front window. Outside, Marcus's rental sedan sat parked neatly along the curb, clean but unremarkable. No government plates. No official markings. Nothing suggested the man inside the diner held any position of importance. The sheriff looked back toward Marcus with growing certainty that he was hiding something. "Stand up," Bradley said firmly. The words immediately changed the atmosphere. Several customers exchanged nervous glances. Maggie opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, then quietly stopped herself. Marcus remained seated, not out of defiance, but out of calm curiosity. "May I ask why?" Bradley answered without hesitation. "Because I am instructing you to." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Sheriff, I have cooperated with every question you have asked. If there is a legal reason for another request, I will gladly listen." Bradley interpreted the response as resistance rather than restraint. His confidence hardened into determination. Somewhere outside, a church clock began striking the hour, each bell echoing softly across Main Street. Inside the diner, nobody noticed the passing time anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the booth by the window, where one man believed unquestioned authority demanded immediate compliance, while the other quietly believed that true authority never needed to raise its voice. Marcus Ellington looked at Sheriff Bradley Hayes for several quiet seconds before slowly pushing his chair back from the table. The legs scraped softly across the wooden floor, the sound somehow louder than the conversations that had completely disappeared from the diner. Every customer watched without speaking. Marcus stood calmly, smoothing the front of his jacket before looking at the sheriff with the same composed expression he had carried since breakfast began. "Thank you," he said gently. "Now, may I understand what concern you are trying to address?" Bradley stepped closer, convinced that confidence itself was suspicious. You have avoided direct answers since I walked in. Marcus gave a small nod. I answered every question you asked. Not all of them. I answered every question that required an answer. That distinction only deepened Bradley's frustration. In his mind, authority meant immediate compliance, not thoughtful conversation. He glanced toward the deputies, who remained frozen near the counter, clearly uncertain whether they should become involved. Maggie quietly placed the coffee pot on the counter, her hands no longer steady. She had seen disagreements before, but never one that felt so strangely one-sided. The man standing before the sheriff had shown nothing except patience. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the back of his chair. Sheriff, if there is a specific law you believe I have violated, I would appreciate knowing what it is. If not, I would like to finish my breakfast and continue my day. The room felt even quieter. Bradley heard the words, but what echoed inside his mind was something else entirely. He believed the stranger was questioning his authority in front of the entire town. Pride quietly replaced judgment. Turn around, Bradley said firmly. Several customers looked at one another in disbelief. One elderly veteran slowly removed his glasses, unable to believe what he was hearing. A young mother instinctively pulled her son a little closer without taking her eyes off the unfolding scene. Marcus remained perfectly still. Sheriff, he replied calmly, I have treated you with respect from the beginning. I hope we can continue this conversation the same way. Bradley removed a pair of handcuffs from his duty belt. The metallic sound immediately drew everyone's attention. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The atmosphere became so heavy that even the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed unnaturally loud. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly toward the handcuffs before looking back at the sheriff. There was no fear in his face. No anger. Only quiet disappointment, as though he had hoped the morning would take a different path. Are you certain, Marcus asked in a measured voice, that this is the decision you wish to make? Bradley answered without hesitation. Absolutely. Marcus gave one slow nod. Very well. Without resistance, he placed his hands where the sheriff instructed. Several people exchanged stunned looks. They expected protests, arguments, raised voices, anything except complete cooperation. Marcus offered none of it. His calm dignity somehow filled the room more powerfully than shouting ever could. The handcuffs closed with a sharp metallic click that echoed through Maggie's country kitchen like the final note of a song no one wanted to hear. Outside the front window, a passerby stopped and looked inside. Another person slowed near the entrance, sensing that something unusual was happening. Within moments, more curious faces gathered along the sidewalk. Marcus simply stood in silence, his breakfast growing cold behind him, while Bradley believed he had successfully demonstrated control. Yet Marcus quietly looked around the room, meeting the worried eyes of the customers one by one before saying in a calm voice that carried through the silence, sometimes the greatest test of authority is not whether it can be exercised, but whether it should be. The quiet inside Maggie's country kitchen stretched so long that even the old clock above the cash register seemed to tick more slowly. Marcus Ellington remained standing exactly where he was, his hands restrained, his expression calm, his eyes moving gently from one concerned face to another. No bitterness crossed his features. No anger clouded his judgment. He simply waited with the patience of a man who had spent an entire career understanding that truth rarely needed to hurry. Sheriff Bradley Hayes believed the silence belonged to him. He looked around the diner as though expecting approval for restoring order. Instead, he found uncertainty. The elderly veteran quietly lowered his eyes. The young mother hugged her son a little closer. Maggie stood frozen behind the counter, unable to shake the feeling that something deeply wrong had just happened. Then, outside the front window, a black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly onto Main Street before continuing past the diner. Bradley barely noticed it. Government vehicles occasionally passed through town. There was nothing unusual about that. A second black sport utility vehicle appeared less than 30 seconds later, followed by another. They moved without flashing lights or unnecessary attention, parking neatly along the curb a short distance from the restaurant. Several people standing outside glanced toward the growing line of vehicles. One man quietly reached for his phone. Inside the diner, Marcus remained perfectly still. His breathing never changed. His shoulders never tightened. It was almost as though he had expected the morning to unfold exactly this way. Bradley noticed the gathering crowd outside and frowned. "Looks like you are attracting attention," he said. Marcus answered softly. "Attention often arrives after decisions have already been made." The sheriff dismissed the remark with a slight shake of his head. Before he could respond, one of his deputies felt a radio vibrate softly on his belt. He glanced down, listened briefly, then looked confused. "Sheriff," he began cautiously, "dispatch is asking for your location." Bradley waved him off without turning around. "Tell them I am busy." The deputy hesitated. "They said it is urgent." Bradley's voice hardened. "I said I am busy." The deputy reluctantly acknowledged the message, but the uncertainty on his face only grew. Outside, the doors of the parked vehicles opened almost simultaneously. Several men and women wearing dark business suits stepped onto the sidewalk. None displayed their credentials openly. None hurried. Their calm, disciplined movements drew immediate attention from everyone standing nearby. They quietly surveyed the area before exchanging a few brief words through nearly invisible communication earpieces. Customers inside the diner began whispering among themselves. "Who are they?" someone asked softly. "Maybe state investigators," another guessed. Maggie looked through the window and felt her heartbeat quicken. She had owned the diner long enough to recognize people who carried themselves with quiet authority. These visitors did not look lost. They looked expected. Marcus briefly glanced toward the window before returning his attention to the sheriff. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only the quiet acceptance of someone watching events reach their natural conclusion. Bradley finally noticed the unusual activity outside. He turned toward the window, narrowing his eyes as another dark sedan pulled to the curb. For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across his face. The deputies exchanged nervous looks as their radios vibrated once more, this time almost together. One deputy listened carefully before his eyes widened. He slowly lowered the radio without speaking, staring first toward the arriving officials and then toward the calm man standing quietly in front of the breakfast booth. Marcus gently lifted his gaze and spoke with the same steady courtesy that had never left him from the beginning. "Sheriff," he said, "there is still time for today to be remembered for wisdom instead of pride." The first person through the diner's front door was a woman in a charcoal business suit, whose calm expression immediately changed the atmosphere. She paused for only a fraction of a second as her eyes settled on Marcus Ellington, standing quietly near the booth. Then, with unmistakable purpose, she walked forward. Behind her, 6 more men and women entered in measured silence, each carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of professionals who understood exactly why they were there. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody rushed. Yet every customer instinctively stepped aside. Sheriff Bradley Hayes turned toward the newcomers with visible irritation. "This area is under my authority," he said firmly. "Can I help you?" The woman reached into her jacket and displayed a federal credential. Bradley glanced at it briefly before looking back at her face. "Special Agent Rachel Donovan," she said calmly. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." A murmur spread across the diner. Bradley folded his arms. "What is the purpose of your visit?" Rachel did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward Marcus, noticing the handcuffs still secured around his wrists. For the first time since entering, her professional composure revealed the slightest hint of surprise. "Sir," she said respectfully to Marcus, "are you all right?" Marcus offered a reassuring smile. "I am perfectly fine, Agent Donovan." Every deputy in the room noticed the way she addressed him. Not by his first name, not as a witness. Simply, "Sir." Bradley frowned. "You know this man?" Rachel slowly turned back toward the sheriff. "Yes." "Who is he?" Before she could answer, another man in a dark navy suit entered through the doorway carrying a slim leather portfolio. He stopped beside Rachel, looked directly at Marcus, and spoke with complete professionalism. "Director Ellington, the secure meeting location is ready whenever you are." The words seemed to remove every sound from the diner. Coffee cups remained suspended halfway to waiting hands. Even the people gathered outside the windows stopped moving. Bradley stared at the newcomer, uncertain he had heard correctly. "Director," he repeated quietly. The man opened the leather portfolio and presented an official identification folder. The gold seal was unmistakable. "This is Director Marcus Ellington of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said with calm clarity. "He is here on an official visit authorized at the highest level." Bradley looked slowly toward Marcus. The quiet traveler who had thanked the waitress, complimented the biscuits, and patiently answered every question now stood before him exactly as he had all morning, except one detail had changed. Everyone else finally understood who he was. The sheriff's confident posture seemed to disappear all at once. His eyes dropped to the handcuffs still resting around Marcus's wrists. No one spoke. No one needed to. The silence itself carried more weight than any accusation ever could. Marcus met Bradley's gaze without satisfaction or anger. "Sheriff," he said gently, "titles matter far less than the way we treat people before we know their titles." Rachel Donovan stepped forward respectfully. "Sir, may I?" Marcus gave a slight nod. One of Bradley's deputies immediately reached for the handcuff key with visibly shaking hands. As the restraints were quietly removed, the metallic click echoed through the diner once again, but this time it sounded completely different. It no longer represented authority. It marked the exact moment when assumptions collapsed, pride gave way to reality, and an entire town witnessed that true leadership never needed to announce itself, because character had already spoken long before any badge or title ever did. No one inside Maggie's country kitchen seemed to remember how to breathe. The silence that followed the removal of the handcuffs felt heavier than anything that had happened before. Sheriff Bradley Hayes remained motionless, staring at the empty restraint now resting in his deputy's hand, as though he could somehow reverse the last several minutes. Around him, every familiar face in the diner reflected the same mixture of disbelief and quiet reflection. Marcus Ellington gently adjusted the sleeve of his jacket before offering a polite nod to the deputy who had unlocked the cuffs. "Thank you," he said sincerely. The young deputy lowered his eyes. "Yes, sir." There was no embarrassment in Marcus's expression, no satisfaction at seeing the room transformed. Instead, he walked back toward the booth where his breakfast still waited untouched. His coffee had gone cold. The toast had lost its warmth. Even so, he smiled gently at Maggie. "Would it be possible to trouble you for another cup of coffee?" Maggie blinked twice before finding her voice. "Of course. It would be my pleasure." She quickly filled a fresh mug with steaming coffee and placed it carefully on the table. "I am so sorry about everything that happened here this morning." Marcus looked up with quiet kindness. "You have nothing to apologize for. You treated every customer with dignity." Those simple words seemed to lift an invisible weight from Maggie's shoulders. Nearby, Agent Rachel Donovan quietly conferred with another member of the federal team before approaching Marcus again. "Sir, the conference room has been secured. The county officials have already arrived." Marcus nodded once. "We will leave shortly." He then turned toward Sheriff Hayes, who still stood silently in the middle of the dining room. "Sheriff," Marcus said, his voice calm enough that everyone could hear. "Before we leave, I would like to ask you one question." Bradley slowly raised his eyes. "Yes, sir. When you first walked through that door this morning, what did you know about me?" Bradley hesitated. "Nothing." Marcus nodded gently. "Exactly. You knew nothing about my profession, my family, my purpose for visiting your town, or my character. Yet decisions were made before facts were gathered. That is a burden no public servant should ever carry." The words were spoken without accusation. They sounded more like a lesson than a judgment. Several customers quietly wiped tears from their eyes. The elderly veteran removed his cap and held it respectfully against his chest. Outside, more townspeople had gathered along the sidewalk, watching through the windows as the unexpected moment unfolded. Agent Donovan received another message through her earpiece before quietly informing Marcus that representatives from the Department of Justice had arrived at the courthouse ahead of schedule. Marcus acknowledged the update, then looked once more around the diner. "Every community deserves law enforcement that earns trust through fairness," he said softly. "Authority is strongest when people never have to fear how it will be used." No one argued. No one interrupted. Even Sheriff Hayes simply listened. The confidence that had filled the room earlier that morning had been replaced by something far more valuable: reflection. As Marcus prepared to leave with the federal team, the morning sunlight streamed through the front windows, illuminating the small diner with a warmth that seemed entirely different from when the day had begun. The town of Ashford had expected an ordinary breakfast. Instead, it had received an unforgettable lesson that would remain in the memories of everyone present long after the coffee cups had been cleared from the tables. Marcus Ellington stepped toward the front door with the same quiet confidence he had carried into the diner earlier that morning. The federal team naturally formed around him, not because he demanded it, but because genuine leadership inspired respect without asking for it. As he reached the entrance, he paused and turned back one final time. Every face inside Maggie's country kitchen was fixed on him. The conversations that had once filled the room had been replaced by thoughtful silence. Sheriff Bradley Hayes remained standing near the center of the dining room, his shoulders no longer carrying the certainty that had accompanied him only an hour before. Marcus looked at him with calm sincerity. "Sheriff, every day gives us another opportunity to become the kind of public servant our communities deserve. I truly hope today becomes that opportunity for you." Bradley swallowed quietly before answering. "Director Ellington, I cannot change what happened this morning, but I can learn from it." Marcus nodded gently. "Learning is where real change begins." Those words settled into the room more deeply than any formal speech could have. They carried no humiliation. They offered no triumph. They simply reminded everyone listening that accountability was not about destroying a person. It was about rebuilding trust. Outside, the cool autumn air greeted the group as they stepped onto Main Street. The gathered townspeople respectfully moved aside, many removing their hats as Marcus passed. Some had recorded portions of the morning on their phones, but now very few seemed interested in capturing another moment. Instead, they simply watched, reflecting on what they had witnessed. Marcus briefly stopped beside Maggie, who had followed him to the doorway. She handed him a small paper bag with a warm smile. "Fresh biscuits for the road," she said. "Breakfast should never end the way this one did." Marcus accepted the bag with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Maggie. Your kindness is what people will remember long after today." She smiled through misty eyes. "Safe travels, sir." As the federal vehicles prepared to depart, one of the younger deputies quietly approached Sheriff Hayes. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "what happens now?" Bradley looked across the street where Marcus was entering one of the waiting vehicles. For the first time in many years, he answered without pretending to have every solution. "Now we remember why the badge exists," he said softly. "It is not there to prove who has power. It is there to remind us who we serve." The deputy slowly nodded. Around them, Ashford began returning to its ordinary rhythm. Store owners unlocked their doors. School buses continued their routes. Church bells echoed once again across the quiet town. Life moved forward, but everyone who had stood inside that diner understood that something invisible had changed. Weeks later, Maggie's country kitchen would still be serving coffee to the same regular customers, but the story of that morning would be shared with every newcomer who sat near the front window. Not because the visitor had been one of the most powerful law enforcement leaders in the country, but because he had chosen patience over pride, dignity over anger, and wisdom over revenge. The lesson spread far beyond the walls of the little diner and even beyond the streets of Ashford itself. It became a reminder that the measure of character is revealed long before titles are known, and that justice is strongest when it begins with simple human respect. Because a badge may represent authority, but integrity is what earns lasting trust. And the people who quietly honor every person's dignity will always leave behind the greatest legacy of all.